Part 2. The Wolves Awaken. 3 months passed after the withdrawal, and the galaxy waited for humanity to fall apart. The Council controlled the major trade routes. They controlled the fuel depots, the communication relays, the supply lines that kept civilizations running. Without access to any of it, most species would starve within a year. That was the whole point of the system. You stayed in the Council because leaving meant death. The Velhari were sure of it. High Speaker Zorvan told his advisors that the humans would send a quiet message within 6 months, asking to renegotiate. He said they would accept harsher terms than before, and that would be the end of their little rebellion. He was wrong. The Council sent Sub-Speaker Lyrae of the Athoni to Earth as a diplomatic envoy. The Athoni were empaths. They could feel the emotions of other beings, which made them useful as mediators and even more useful as spies. Lyrae was chosen because she was calm, experienced, and because the Council wanted to know how desperate the humans really were. Lyrae arrived at Solomon Gate, Earth's main orbital station, expecting to find a government in crisis. She expected rationing, fear, confusion. She expected to walk into a room full of people ready to make a deal. Instead, Kevin Darrow met her at the docking bay with a polite smile and a cup of coffee. He looked rested. He looked calm. That was the first thing that worried her. Kevin took Lyrae on a tour. President Beckett had authorized him to show the Athoni envoy a carefully chosen selection of what humanity had been building in secret over the past decade. First, he showed her the belt yards. Hidden among the asteroids between Mars and Jupiter, humanity had constructed a second shipyard, completely invisible to Council sensors. It had been operating for 9 years. Then he showed her the Sentinel network. Thousands of stealth satellites, each one no bigger than a household table, ringed every human colony world. They could detect ships jumping into a system before those ships even finished their arrival sequence. Finally, he showed her the Carthage line. The Carthage-class warships were something new. They were not big. Council species built enormous vessels, slow and powerful, designed to intimidate. The Carthage ships were fast, agile, and packed with weapons that the Council had never seen. Humanity had developed them quietly, testing them in deep space, far from any trade route or sensor grid. Lyrae stood on the observation deck of Solomon Gate and looked at 3 Carthage ships holding formation in orbit. She could feel the pride radiating from every human on the station. It was not arrogance. It was something deeper. It was the feeling of people who had been underestimated their entire lives and no longer cared to hide what they were. "You planned this," Lyrae said. Kevin sipped his coffee. "We hoped we would never need it. But yes, we planned this." Lyrae sent her report back to the Council that evening. She did not soften it. She wrote that humanity had not withdrawn in desperation. They had withdrawn because they were ready, and that any attempt to force them back into the Accord would result in a war the Council was not prepared to fight. Zorvan read the report and dismissed it. He said the Athoni were too emotional and too easily impressed. He pushed forward with the economic blockade. All Council species were forbidden from trading with humanity. Anyone who broke the blockade would face sanctions. President Beckett received the blockade announcement while sitting in her office on Earth. She read it carefully. Then she looked at Admiral Granger, who was standing by the window. "How long can we last on our own?" she asked. Granger had already run the numbers. Humanity's 14 colony worlds were spread across a wide stretch of space. Some were agricultural, some were industrial. A few were rich in minerals. None of them had everything they needed. But together, if they managed their resources carefully, they could survive. "Long enough," he said. Beckett nodded. "Then we survive." Across human space, people tightened their belts. Rations were introduced on some worlds. Fuel was conserved. Luxury goods disappeared from markets. But there was no panic. There was something else instead, something that the Council had not expected. There was anger. The broadcast of humanity's withdrawal had stirred something in people. The knowledge that the Council had ignored 9,000 kidnapped civilians, that it had tried to cage humanity rather than help it, had turned into a fire that burned in every home, every school, every barracks. People did not just accept the hardship, they embraced it. Farmers worked longer hours. Factory workers took extra shifts. Scientists shared research freely. The old national borders that still existed on paper meant nothing. Everyone was Terran now. On Haven's Rest, Danny Sutton felt that fire too, but he also felt something else. Fear. His garrison was small, 400 soldiers on a farming world of 12,000 people, most of them families. They had one orbital defense platform, a handful of ground vehicles, and enough ammunition to last maybe 3 weeks in a real fight. Danny wrote letters to his mother back on Earth every week. He told her the food was good. He told her the sunsets on Haven's Rest were beautiful, which was true. He told her everything was fine, which was not. He had been watching the long-range sensors for weeks. There were ships at the edge of the system. They were not human ships. They moved in short, quick patterns, jumping in and out of sensor range. Testing. Watching. Danny knew what Krithan raiders looked like on a sensor screen. He had studied the reports from every raid on the Vega corridor. He knew their tactics. They scouted first. They watched for weeks, sometimes months. They mapped defenses. They identified the weakest point, and then they came fast, all at once, overwhelming everything in their path. He told his soldiers to sleep with their boots on. On Foss Marine, the Council held another emergency session. The Krithan representative's chair was empty. Grawl had returned to his homeworld weeks ago without explanation. The Velhari pushed for stronger measures against humanity. The Atheni counseled patience. No one noticed that the Krithan war fleet had begun to move. Danny Sutton noticed. On a cool evening, with the sun setting orange and gold over the grain fields of Haven's Rest, Danny stood on the wall of his garrison and watched his sensor display. 3 contacts had appeared in high orbit. They were big. They were not hiding anymore. He picked up his communicator and sent a single word to Terran Fleet Command, millions of miles away. Contact. Then he turned to his sergeant, a steady woman named Liz Pace, who had served twice as long as he had, and said, "Wake everyone up. We have company." Liz looked at the sensor display. Her face went hard. She did not ask questions. She simply turned and began shouting orders. Across the garrison, lights came on, boots hit floors, weapons were pulled from racks. 400 soldiers began preparing for something that none of them had ever faced before. Above them, 3 Krithan warships settled into orbit, like vultures circling a wounded animal. Danny looked up at the sky. He could not see them with his eyes, but he could feel them. He took a slow breath and placed his hand on the wall of the garrison. "All right," he said quietly, to no one in particular. Part 3. The Siege of Haven's Rest and the Fire That Follows. The orbital defense platform died first. It was a small thing, barely more than a ring of cannons bolted onto a metal frame. It had been built to discourage pirates, not to fight warships. The lead Krithan vessel destroyed it with a single volley. The explosion lit up the night sky over Haven's Rest like a second sun, and 12,000 colonists looked up from their homes and their fields and knew that something terrible had begun. Danny Sutton did not watch the explosion. He was already moving. He had spent the last 3 weeks preparing for this. He had studied every report from the Vega corridor raids. He knew what the Krithan wanted. They did not come to destroy. They came to harvest. They wanted living bodies. That meant they would send ground troops. That meant they would land. And that meant Danny had a chance. He pulled his garrison back to the colony's central agricultural complex. It was the largest structure on Haven's Rest, a sprawling collection of grain silos, processing buildings, and storage barns, surrounded by irrigation trenches that ran deep and wide. It was not a fortress, but Danny looked at those trenches and those thick concrete silos and saw something he could work with. He ordered his soldiers to dig in. They turned the irrigation trenches into firing positions. They stacked grain bags into walls. They positioned their heaviest weapons on top of the silos, giving them a clear line of fire across the flat farmland that stretched in every direction. Then the colonists came. Danny had ordered an evacuation to the underground shelters beneath the complex. Most of the families went. The children went. But nearly 300 adults refused to go underground. They came to the garrison with whatever they had: hunting rifles, tools, kitchen knives. One man brought a welding torch and said he could seal any door the Krython tried to break through. Danny looked at them. Farmers, engineers, teachers, people who had come to Haven's Rest to grow food and raise families in peace. They were afraid. He could see it in their eyes, but they were not leaving. An old woman pushed her way to the front of the group. Her name was Peggy Hollins. She was 74 years old, with white hair pulled back tight and a face like weathered leather. She had served in the Terran Marines 40 years ago, back before humanity had even joined the Council. She looked at Danny and said, "Lieutenant, I know you are young, and I know this is bad, but I did not cross 30 light years to let some overgrown lizards take my neighbors. Tell me where you want us." He assigned Peggy command of the civilian volunteers and gave her the western perimeter. The Krython landed at dawn. 2,000 ground troops poured out of dropships onto the fields east of the complex. They were big, each one standing 7 feet tall with thick scaled skin and 4 arms. They carried plasma rifles and bladed weapons. Their commander, a warlord named Dreth Vaughn, had led dozens of slave raids across the galaxy. He expected this to be easy. The first wave charged across the open farmland in a wide line, roaring as they came. Danny let them get close. He waited until they were 200 meters out, well within the range of every weapon his people had. Then he gave the order. 400 soldiers and 300 civilians opened fire at the same time. The sound was deafening. The Krython front line crumbled. Dozens fell in the first seconds. The rest stumbled. They had never met resistance like this on a farming colony. The first assault was thrown back. Dreth Vaughn was furious. He called down orbital bombardment from the ships above. Plasma fire rained down on the complex. Buildings burned. One of the grain silos collapsed in a roar of flame and dust. 17 people died in the bombardment, soldiers and civilians alike. But the complex held. The silos were built from reinforced concrete, meant to withstand storms. The trenches protected the defenders from the worst of the fire. When the bombardment stopped and the dust settled, Danny's voice came over the comm, steady and clear. "All positions report." One by one they reported. Battered, bleeding, still alive, still fighting. The days blurred together. Day 3. A second ground assault hit the southern wall. Liz Pace held the line with 60 soldiers and a group of farmers who loaded weapons faster than trained crews. Water supplies were hit by orbital fire. Danny organized teams to dig new wells inside the perimeter. They found water at 12 feet. Day 7. The Krython tried a night assault on the eastern perimeter. It nearly worked. They breached the wall in 2 places. Fighting was hand-to-hand in the dark. Humans against Krython in the narrow trenches. The line held, but barely. Day 9. Danny lost contact with the eastern listening post. He took a squad of 8 soldiers and went to find out what happened. What he found made him stop in his tracks. A group of colonists, led by a 17-year-old boy named Chris Harmon, had held the breach for 6 hours. Chris had rigged mining explosives to the walls and detonated them each time the Chthon pushed through, collapsing the passage and buying time. When he ran out of explosives, he used a repurposed mining drill as a weapon, standing in the gap and refusing to move. Danny found Chris sitting against a wall, covered in dust and blood, his left arm shattered below the elbow. He was still conscious. He looked up at Danny and said, "I think they stopped coming." Danny knelt beside him and called for a medic. He did not trust his voice to say anything else. Day 12. The food ran out. The ammunition was almost gone. The defenders were exhausted. Some had not slept in 3 days. The wounded filled every sheltered space in the complex. The medics worked with whatever they had left, which was almost nothing. Danny sat in the command post, a small room in the basement of the main processing building, and wrote what he believed would be his last message. He transmitted it to Terran Fleet Command. "This is Lieutenant Danny Sutton, Haven's Rest Garrison. We are still here. Send help or send remembrance. Either way, we hold." The message traveled across space. It passed through relay stations and communication buoys. It reached Earth 18 hours later. Admiral Cole Granger read it aboard his flagship, the Resolute Dawn, which was stationed with the Third Fleet in a holding position near the edge of the solar system. He had been waiting. The fleet was ready. It had been ready for weeks. But moving it meant crossing space controlled by the blockade. It meant the Council would see. It meant war, not just with the Chthon, but potentially with the entire Council. Granger sat in his quarters and read Danny's message 3 times. He thought about his brother Paul, who had been taken from Vega Prime and never seen again. He thought about the 9,000 others. He thought about the 12,000 people on Haven's Rest, the farmers, and the children, and the old Marine named Peggy, and the kid who held a wall with a mining drill. He walked to the bridge. His officers looked at him. "Set course for Haven's Rest," he said. "All ships, maximum speed." No one hesitated. The Third Fleet, 18 warships led by the Resolute Dawn, jumped into faster-than-light travel and disappeared from the solar system. On day 15, Danny Sutton was on the wall when the sky changed. Flashes of light appeared in high orbit, one after another, like stars being born. 18 Terran warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel directly above Haven's Rest. The Chthon ships, which had been sitting comfortably in orbit for over 2 weeks, suddenly found themselves facing a full battle fleet. The fight in orbit was short and brutal. 2 Chthon warships were destroyed in the first exchange. The third tried to run. The Resolute Dawn chased it down and crippled its engines. It was boarded and captured. On the ground, Chthon troops received no orders from above. Their commander, Dreth Vaughn, tried to organize a retreat, but there was nowhere to retreat to. Terran dropships came down through the smoke. Thousands of fresh soldiers poured onto the surface of Haven's Rest. The remaining Chthon forces were surrounded and destroyed within hours. Danny Sutton stood on the wall and watched the dropships land. He had not slept in 4 days. He was covered in dirt and dried blood. His hands were shaking. He sat down slowly in the dust, his back against the wall he had defended for 17 days. He watched soldiers in clean uniforms pour past him, moving fast, and he said quietly, "About time." Liz Pace found him there an hour later. She sat down next to him. Neither of them spoke for a long while. Finally, Danny said, "How many did we lose?" Liz told him, 41 soldiers, 19 civilians. 60 people who had been alive 17 days ago and were not alive now. Danny closed his eyes. The images from Haven's Rest spread across the galaxy within days. Every species saw them. The burned fields, the shattered silos, the trenches full of spent ammunition, the faces of the children who had hidden underground for 17 days. the old woman with white hair standing on a broken wall, the teenage boy with a ruined arm and a grin that could not be explained. President Beckett addressed the galaxy in a public broadcast. She stood alone in a plain room. She did not use notes. She showed the images. She named every one of the 60 dead. She named the Krython ships. She named the slave markets that the Council had refused to acknowledge. And then she asked one question. Where was the Council? The broadcast ended. The galaxy was silent. Within a week, 3 junior species quietly reached out to the Terran Republic through back channels. The Tessari, the Morvain, the Delvhari. They had their own wounds. They had their own grievances. They had been watching Haven's Rest, and they had seen something they had never seen before. A species that fought not to conquer, but to protect. Part 4. The Fracturing of the Accord. The galaxy had not seen anything like Haven's Rest in 1,000 years. A junior species, the youngest member ever admitted to the Council, had not only defied the greatest powers in known space, but had fought back and won. The images played on every network, every station, every world. The burned fields, the teenage boy with the mining drill, the old woman on the wall, the garrison of 400 that had held against 2,000. The Council could not ignore it. The question was what to do about it. The answer depended on who you asked. High Speaker Zorvan of the Velhari was clear. This was rebellion. It was a disease that would spread if it was not crushed quickly. He demanded a military response, a fleet large enough to end the human problem permanently. Sub-Speaker Lyrae of the Atheni disagreed. She had felt Kevin Darrow's resolve in the council chamber. She had seen the Carthage warships in orbit around Earth. She told the council that a war with humanity would be long, bloody, and uncertain. She said the images from Haven's Rest had already changed the way other species saw the council. An attack on Earth would make humans into something far more dangerous than rebels. It would make them into heroes. Zorvan did not listen. The Krython wanted revenge. The loss at Haven's Rest was a humiliation that the warlord clans would not forgive. Graal, the Krython representative, had returned to his homeworld to rally support. He promised his people that they would burn every human colony to ash and take 10 times the slaves they had lost. Together, the Velhari and the Krython began building the largest military fleet assembled in over a century. 312 warships gathered at the Krython staging world of Ashvar Prime. They came from every corner of Velhari and Krython space. Battleships the size of small cities, cruisers bristling with weapons, troop carriers loaded with soldiers. It was a force designed not just to defeat humanity, but to erase it. While the council built its fleet, Kevin Darrow worked. He had set up his office on Solomon Gate, Earth's orbital station. It was a small room with a desk, a communication console, and a window that looked out at the stars. He slept on a cot in the corner. He ate when he remembered to, which was not often. Kevin understood something that most council species did not. The galaxy was not as stable as it appeared. The council had ruled for 10,000 years, but not because every species loved them. Most species tolerated the council because they were afraid. Afraid of the Velhari fleet, afraid of economic sanctions, afraid of being alone. Haven's Rest had cracked that fear. Kevin reached out to every species that had ever been treated as lesser by the council. He sent messages. He made calls. He asked questions, and he listened to the answers. He did not promise power or protection. He promised something simpler, a seat at a table where every voice counted the same. The Tessari were the first to respond. They were a small insectoid species, quiet and careful. Their homeworld had been strip-mined by the Velhari 3 centuries ago, under a resource-sharing agreement that was never fair. They had nothing left but their people and their anger. The Tasari ambassador met Kevin through a secure channel. She spoke through a translation device in a voice like dry leaves rustling. She said, "We have been afraid for a very long time. Your people showed us that fear is a choice." The Tasari formally withdrew from the council. The Morvain followed within a week. Then the Delthari. Then 3 more species that Kevin had never even contacted. Within 2 months, 6 of the galaxy's 31 recognized species had either left the council or suspended their membership. The council was fracturing. Zorvan watched it happen, and his fury grew cold. He convened a war council with the Krithan leadership and proposed something that had never been done before. A joint Velhari-Krithan fleet would strike Earth itself. Not the colonies, not the border worlds. Earth, the homeworld, the heart. He believed that if Earth fell, the rebellion would die. Lyrae opposed the plan in open session. It was the first time in recorded history that an Aethoni had publicly broken with the council majority. She stood before the speakers and said that attacking Earth would be the greatest mistake the council had ever made. She said it would prove every word Kevin Darrow had ever spoken, and turn humanity into a cause that would inspire the galaxy for generations. Zorvan stripped her of her title and dismissed her from the chamber. The fleet at Ashvar Prime continued to grow. Admiral Granger learned about the fleet from an unexpected source. The Tessari, grateful for humanity's example, had spies in council space. They sent intelligence reports to Earth. One of those reports included the fleet composition at Ashvar Prime, the planned route to Earth, and the estimated launch date. Granger read the report in his quarters aboard the Resolute Dawn. 312 enemy warships. His entire fleet numbered 47. He studied the intelligence for 3 days. He barely slept. He pulled up star charts and tactical simulations and fleet disposition reports. He talked to his captains. He talked to his intelligence officers. He ran the numbers again and again. On the 3rd night, he found what he was looking for. The fleet at Ashvar Prime was still assembling. Ships were arriving from across council space, which meant the fleet was not yet organized. The Velhari and Krithan had different command structures, different communication systems, different tactics. They were allies of convenience, not a unified force. If they were given time to drill and coordinate, they would be unstoppable. But they had not been given that time yet. Granger went to President Beckett with his plan. He did not want to defend Earth. He wanted to attack Ashvar Prime before the fleet was ready. Beckett listened. She asked questions. She understood the risk. If Granger failed, Earth would have no fleet left to protect it. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said 2 words. Go hunting. The Terran Third Fleet, reinforced to 47 warships, made the jump to Ashvar Prime on a cold Tuesday morning. They arrived through a series of micro-jumps, a technique that human navigators had perfected in secret. Instead of arriving in a single formation that could be targeted, the fleet scattered across the system in unpredictable patterns, appearing and disappearing like ghosts. The council tacticians had never seen anything like it. The Battle of Ashvar Prime lasted 11 hours. The human ships were smaller and faster. They did not try to match the council vessels in firepower. Instead, they used speed and coordination, striking in groups, hitting weak points, and vanishing before the heavier ships could bring their weapons to bear. The Velhari battleships, built for overwhelming force, could not track targets that moved like that. The Krithan warships, designed for terror rather than real combat, broke formation under pressure. Granger commanded from the bridge of the Resolute Dawn. He was calm. His orders were precise. He moved his fleet like a surgeon, cutting where it mattered, avoiding where it did not. 6 hours into the battle, the Krython flagship exploded. Grahal was aboard. He had been giving orders when a Terran strike group hit the ship from 3 directions at once. The flagship broke apart in a flash of white light. The Krython fleet lost its nerve. Ships began retreating, scattering into deep space. The Velhari held longer, but without their allies, they were outnumbered by a fleet that was faster, better coordinated, and fighting with a fury that could not be calculated by tactical computers. By the 11th hour, it was over. The Terran fleet had lost 12 ships. 914 sailors were dead. The Council Armada had lost 87 warships. The staging area at Ashvar Prime was in ruins. Dreth Von, the warlord who had attacked Haven's Rest, was captured alive when his crippled cruiser was boarded by Terran Marines. The battle footage spread across the galaxy even faster than the images from Haven's Rest. Every species watched a fleet of 47 ships tear apart an armada of over 300. They watched the micro-jumps. They watched the coordinated strikes. They watched the Krython run. And they understood something that changed the galaxy forever. Humanity was not a junior species. Humanity was not a problem to be contained. Humanity was something the Council had never planned for. On Earth, the news arrived at dawn. President Beckett stood at the window of her office and watched the sun rise over the city. The streets below were empty. People were just waking up, just checking their screens, just beginning to understand what had happened overnight. An aide entered the room. "What happens now?" she asked. Beckett did not turn from the window. The sunlight touched her face. She looked tired. She looked relieved. She looked like a woman who had carried something very heavy for a very long time and was finally allowed to set it down. "Now we build something better," she said. Part 5. A New Order. The Galactic Council did not die on a single day. It bled out slowly over the months that followed Ashvar Prime, like a wounded animal that did not yet know it was finished. The Velhari retreated to their core worlds. They sealed their borders and refused all communication. 10,000 years of dominance, and they could not accept that it was ending. Zorvan remained High Speaker, but he spoke to an empty chamber. One by one, the seats on the council went vacant as species walked away. The Krython were worse off. The warlord clans turned on each other without Graal to hold them together. Civil war broke out across their territory within weeks. The slave markets, which the council had tolerated for centuries, were abandoned as the Krython fought among themselves. It was not justice, not exactly, but for the first time in memory, no Krython raider ships crossed into anyone else's space. The Aethoni reached out to humanity first. Lyrae, stripped of her title and exiled by Zorvan, traveled to Earth on a civilian transport. She arrived at Solomon Gate alone, carrying nothing but a small case and a translation device. Kevin Darrow met her at the docking bay. He looked thinner than the last time she had seen him. There were dark circles under his eyes. He had been working without rest for months, building something that had never existed before. "Thank you for coming," he said. Lyrae studied his face with her empathic senses. She felt exhaustion, hope, grief, and underneath it all, a stubborn warmth that she had come to recognize as uniquely human. "Thank you for giving me somewhere to come," she said. Kevin had been drafting what he called the Open Accord. It was simple, which was the point. Every member species got one vote, regardless of age, size, or military power. There were no junior members, no containment directives, no resolutions passed by the powerful against the weak. Disputes would be handled by a rotating panel drawn from all members, and any species could leave at any time without punishment. It was everything the old council was not. Some said it was naive. Some said it would collapse within a year. Kevin did not argue with them. He simply kept working. President Beckett chose the location for the signing ceremony herself. She wanted it held on Haven's Rest. Not Earth, not a grand station or a neutral world. A small farming colony on the edge of human space, where ordinary people had done something extraordinary. The agricultural complex had been rebuilt. It had taken months. The grain silos were new, the walls were new, the trenches had been filled and planted over with grass. But the memorial wall was old. It stood at the center of the complex, built from stones pulled from the rubble, and on it were carved the names of every person who had died. The 60 from the siege, the 914 from Ashvar Prime, the 9,000 taken in the Vega raids, who had never come home. The ceremony was held on a warm afternoon, under a clear blue sky. Ships from a dozen species filled the orbital space above the planet. Shuttles came and went constantly, carrying diplomats and translators, and journalists from across the galaxy. Danny Sutton stood in dress uniform near the front of the gathering. He was a captain now. The promotion had come quietly, without fanfare. He had not asked for it, and did not feel he deserved it. He was 27 years old, and he felt much older. Peggy Holland stood beside him, leaning on a cane. She wore her old Marine insignia pinned to her jacket. She had refused all formal honors, saying she had not done anything special. She had simply done what needed doing. Chris Harmon was there too. He was 18 now. His left arm was gone below the elbow, replaced by a prosthetic that he was still learning to use. He kept flexing the mechanical fingers, watching them move, grinning to himself like a kid with a new toy. He had been offered a place at the Terran Military Academy. He had said yes. 23 species sent representatives to the ceremony. They gathered on the grass in front of the memorial wall. Some were tall, some were small. Some breathed air, some wore environmental suits. They did not look like they belonged together, but they were there. Kevin Darrow gave the opening address. He stood at a simple podium with no flags behind him, no banners, no symbols of power. Just the wall with the names. He did not talk about the battle. He did not talk about victory or strength. He talked about Haven's Rest. He talked about farmers who picked up hunting rifles and stood beside soldiers they had never met. He talked about an old woman who crossed 30 light years to grow wheat and ended up defending a wall. He talked about a boy who held a breach with a mining drill because nobody else was going to do it. He talked about a young lieutenant who sent a message saying, "Send help" or "Send remembrance," and then kept fighting anyway. He talked about what it meant to be alone in the dark and still choose to hold out your hand to someone else. "We did not leave the council because we wanted to rule the galaxy," he said. "We left because we believed the galaxy deserved better than it was getting. This accord is not ours. It belongs to every species that was ever told to sit down and be quiet. Today, you stand. Today, you speak." The applause was strange. Some species clapped. Some hummed. Some pulsed with light. Some simply stood in silence, which was their way of showing the deepest respect. Together, it sounded like nothing Kevin had ever heard. It sounded like the beginning of something. The representatives came forward one by one to sign. The Tesserae ambassador signed with a mark that looked like a knot of fine lines. The Morvain pressed a thermal print. The Delthari sang a single note that was recorded into the document. Lyrae signed on behalf of the Atheni. She used a human pen, which she held awkwardly in her long fingers. As she wrote, she looked up at Kevin and said through her translator, "You are a strange species. You break everything and then try to fix it better than it was." Kevin smiled for the first time in months. "That is more or less the whole story of us," he said. Admiral Granger watched from the back of the crowd. He wore his uniform but no medals. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his face still and quiet. He did not speak. He did not need to. His brother's name was on the wall behind the podium. Paul Granger, taken from Vega Prime, never found. Cole looked at the name for a long time. Then he looked at the crowd of beings from 23 different worlds, standing together on the grass of a small colony that should have been destroyed, but was not. He thought that Paul would have liked this. Paul had always believed in people, even when they gave him no reason to. President Beckett signed last. She walked to the podium slowly, picked up the pen, and wrote her name in careful letters. She set the pen down and looked out at the gathered representatives. She did not give a speech. She simply said, "Let us get to work." The crowd began to move. Diplomats found each other. Translators worked overtime. Arguments started immediately, which was a good sign. It meant people cared. The story ended 6 months later. Haven's rest had changed. The fields were green again, the grain growing tall in the warm sun. The orbital platform had been rebuilt, bigger and better than before. Ships came and went every day, carrying goods and people from a dozen worlds. A Tassari trade delegation had set up a permanent office on the surface. Morvain engineers were helping design a new water system. Delhari musicians played in the colony square on warm evenings, their songs drifting across the fields. Danny Sutton was no longer commanding a garrison. The garrison had been disbanded. Haven's Rest did not need defending anymore. Instead, Danny was overseeing the reconstruction. He spent his days talking to builders and engineers and farmers, helping them plan, solving problems, doing the quiet work of putting a world back together. He stood at the edge of the colony one evening, looking out at the fields. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. It was beautiful. It had always been beautiful, even during the siege, even when the world was burning. He pulled it out and read the message. It was from Kevin Darrow, who now held the title of Secretary of the Open Accord. The message was short. The Velhari have requested observer status at the next Accord Summit. Thought you would want to know. It is starting to work. Danny read it twice. He felt something settle in his chest, something that had been restless for a very long time. It was not happiness exactly. It was not relief. It was something quieter than that. It was the feeling of knowing that the worst was behind them, and that what lay ahead, while difficult, was worth doing. He put the comm back in his pocket. He looked at the sky for another moment, watching the last light fade. Then he turned around and walked back toward the colony. There was a lot to rebuild. And Danny Sutton had never been the kind of man who stood still when there was work to be done. Humans break alliance with the Galactic Council and throw the cosmos into chaos. Part 1. The Breaking Point. The chamber was cold. It was always cold on Foss Marine, the great neutral station where the Galactic Council held its meetings every year. The walls were made of black stone that seemed to swallow light. Pale blue lamps floated near the ceiling, casting long shadows across the faces of the 11 council speakers, who sat in a curved row above the floor. Kevin Darrow stood alone in the center of that floor. He was 57 years old. His hair had gone gray at the temples. His suit was plain and dark. He wore the ceremonial sash of the Celestial Accord across his left shoulder, a strip of silver cloth that marked him as humanity's voice in this chamber. He had worn it for 3 years. It had never felt heavier than it did now. Kevin had spent those 3 years asking the council for one simple thing: help. The Krython, a brutal species known across the galaxy for their slave trade, had been raiding human colonies in the Vega corridor. They came in fast ships. They took people, men, women, children. Over 9,000 civilians in 5 years, dragged away to markets on worlds that the council pretended did not exist. Kevin had filed complaints. He had presented evidence. He had begged. The council had done nothing. Now High Speaker Zorvan of the Velhari, the oldest and most powerful species on the council, looked down at Kevin with 4 pale eyes and delivered the ruling. Humanity's petition for expanded territory was denied. Furthermore, the council had passed a new resolution called the Directive of Containment. Humans would be confined to their current 14 colony worlds. The 3 new warships being built in the Titan shipyards above Saturn would be taken apart. Kevin listened to every word. He did not argue. When Zorvan finished, Kevin asked one question. "And what about our people, the ones the Krython took?" Zorvan's long face showed no emotion. He said that the matter fell within Krython territory and was outside the Council's authority to act. Kevin stood very still for a moment. The chamber was silent. Every speaker watched him. The Aethani, the small telepathic species who served as mediators, shifted uncomfortably. They could feel what Kevin was feeling, even if his face showed nothing. Kevin reached up and pulled the silver sash from his shoulder. He folded it once, then twice, and placed it gently on the stone table in front of him. "Then the accord is over," he said. His voice was quiet. He did not shout. The words hit the chamber like a crack in glass. He turned and walked out. No species had left the Galactic Council in 4,000 years. 12 hours later, on Earth, President Nora Beckett stood before the United Terran Congress in a sealed chamber beneath the Capitol building. She was 61. She had served in the Terran Navy for 20 years before entering politics. She was the kind of woman who never raised her voice, because she never needed to. When Nora Beckett spoke, people listened. She told them everything. She told them about the denied petition. She told them about the containment directive. She told them about Zorvan's answer regarding the 9,000 missing civilians. Then she said, "We joined the council because we believed it stood for something. We were wrong. It stands for control. It stands for the comfort of the powerful at the cost of the weak, and we will not be weak any longer." Every single representative raised their hand. Humanity was leaving the Treaty of Celestial Accord. Across the solar system, in a command room aboard the defense station orbiting Mars, Admiral Cole Granger received the news. He was 63, tall, broad in the shoulders, with deep lines carved into his face by years of service and grief. His younger brother, Paul, had been taken in the second Krython raid on Vega Prime. Paul had been a teacher. He had been 31 years old. Cole had never found out what happened to him. Cole read the Congress vote on his screen. He sat back in his chair and closed his eyes for a long moment. Then he opened them and began giving orders. All 14 colony worlds were to raise their defenses to level 3. The deep space exploration fleet was recalled. Shore leave was canceled across the entire Navy. Supply ships were redirected. Communication arrays were put on high alert. He called his senior captains into a briefing room and told them simply, "We are on our own now. Everything we do from this point forward, we do for ourselves." No one in that room looked afraid. They looked ready. That evening, President Beckett authorized a transmission to be broadcast on every open frequency in the galaxy. It was short. Kevin Darrow had written it himself, sitting in his cabin aboard the Langley's Resolve, as the ship carried him home. The message said, "The Terran Republic formally withdraws from the Treaty of Celestial Accord, effective immediately. We seek no war. We ask only to be left alone. But we will not be caged." The transmission traveled at the speed of light across known space. It reached council stations and trade hubs and colony worlds belonging to dozens of species. It was read by billions of beings who had never thought much about the small young species from the third planet of an ordinary yellow star. On Foss Marine, the council chamber erupted into chaos. Speakers shouted over each other. The Krython representative, a massive figure named Graal, said nothing at all. He simply sat in his chair and smiled, because he saw an opportunity. Zorvan called for order. He called for calm. He said that humanity would come crawling back within a year, begging for trade and protection. Subspeaker Lyrae of the Ethonai, who had felt Kevin Darrow's emotions when he placed that sash on the table, said nothing publicly. But privately, she told her aides something that would prove to be the most accurate prediction anyone made that day. They are not coming back, and I do not think any of us understand what that means yet. Far away, on the colony world of Haven's Rest, a young lieutenant named Danny Sutton read the broadcast on his personal comm while sitting on the roof of his garrison building. He was 26. He had joined the military because it seemed like the right thing to do. He had never fired his weapon at a living target. He read the message twice. Then he looked up at the stars and felt something shift in his chest. It was not fear exactly. It was the feeling of standing at the edge of something very large and knowing that there was no going back. He climbed down from the roof, walked into the garrison, and began checking the weapons locker. He had a feeling they were going to need it.